October 16, 1946, 1:11 a.m. The gymnasium is dead silent. 13 wooden steps, a black hood, a rope, and a man who helped design the Holocaust, now standing at the edge of eternity. His name was Alfred Rosenberg, and in the next few seconds, something would happen at that gallows that no one expected. Something so bizarre, so brutal, so deeply human that witnesses couldn't stop talking about it for decades. But here's the thing that history books never tell you. This moment, this execution, wasn't just an ending, it was a verdict on an entire ideology, on an entire era, on what happens when hatred is given a uniform, a title, and a printing press. Stay with me, because what you're about to learn will change how you see not just Alfred Rosenberg, but the entire machinery of evil that made the Third Reich possible. If you've never heard the name Alfred Rosenberg, that's actually part of the story, because this man was, in many ways, the brains behind Nazi ideology. Not the face, not the fist, the pen. The architect of a racial worldview so twisted, so deliberately constructed, that it gave millions of ordinary people permission to do extraordinary evil. He wasn't born shouting. He wasn't born marching. He was born in 1893 in Revel, what is today Tallinn, Estonia, a young man with a sketchbook, a dream of becoming an architect, and a deeply confused sense of who he was and where he belonged. But somewhere between his student years in Moscow during the Russian Revolution and his arrival in Munich in 1919, something broke inside him. Or maybe it didn't break. Maybe it just found something, and what it found was Adolf Hitler. That meeting, that collision of two deeply wounded egos, would eventually lead to the death of millions. But it all began with pamphlets, with speeches, with words. Words have never been more dangerous than they were in 1920s Germany. And Rosenberg, he was their most deadly author. Before we go further, if you're new here, this is X-History. We don't do surface level. We go deep, we go real, and we go human. Hit subscribe if you want history that actually means something. And stick around, because what's coming in the next few minutes is the kind of story that makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about how genocide gets built. Alright, let's go back. Alfred Rosenberg arrived in Munich like a man looking for a home he'd never had. He was technically an Estonian citizen, ethnically German, academically trained, emotionally a complete mess. He felt like he didn't belong anywhere. And that feeling, that particular cocktail of rootlessness and resentment, is something you'll find at the center of almost every extremist story in history. He wasn't poor. He wasn't starving. He wasn't desperate in the way most people imagine when they think of radicalization. He was searching, and the early Nazi movement gave him exactly what he was looking for: a tribe, a purpose, and a villain to blame. That villain, in Rosenberg's mind, was the Jewish people, and this wasn't a casual prejudice. This was a system. Rosenberg spent years constructing an elaborate pseudo-intellectual framework that tried to explain all of human history through the lens of racial struggle. His 1930 book, The Myth of the 20th Century, was so dense, so aggressively philosophical, that even Hitler reportedly found it unreadable. And yet it sold over 1 million copies. Let that sink in. A book that Hitler found boring sold over 1 million copies, which tells you something terrifying about the hunger that existed in Germany at that time. People weren't just accepting hatred. They were paying for it, reading it, underlining it. And Rosenberg was feeding that hunger with both hands. By the time the Nazi Party rose to power in 1933, Rosenberg had been there from the very beginning, writing, theorizing, recruiting, influencing. He wasn't a general. He wasn't a guard, but without him, the ideology might never have had the intellectual armor it needed to spread the way it did. And that's exactly what makes his story so chilling, because the most dangerous people in history aren't always the ones pulling the trigger. Sometimes they're the ones writing the manual. Here's where the story gets darker. Because up until 1941, Alfred Rosenberg was mostly a theorist, a propagandist, a man who dealt in words and ideas. But then Hitler handed him something real, something with consequences measured not in pages, but in human lives. In July 1941, Just weeks after Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Hitler appointed Rosenberg as Reich Minister for the occupied Eastern Territories. Let that title sit for a moment. Occupied Eastern Territories. That's not a bureaucratic phrase. That's a euphemism for some of the most densely populated land in Europe: Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, home to tens of millions of people who had just had their entire world turned upside down by a German invasion. And now Alfred Rosenberg was in charge of what happened to them. He had an office, he had a staff, he had a budget, and he had an ideology that told him certain people weren't fully human. Now, here's something historians debate even today. Rosenberg, in his own mind, believed he was one of the moderate ones. I know. Take a breath. He actually proposed, in early memos, that some Eastern European populations could be used as a buffer against Soviet influence, that they should be treated with a degree of calculated tolerance. Not out of compassion, out of strategy. But even that thin, cynical restraint was bulldozed almost immediately by the SS, the Wehrmacht, and the brutal logic of Nazi racial war. The Eastern Front wasn't a place where careful memos survived contact with reality. And Rosenberg, the man who built the ideology, found himself watching that ideology devour everything in its path, including his own plans. Did he object? Did he fight back? He wrote letters. He filed complaints. He attended meetings. And then he signed the documents anyway. That is perhaps the most quietly damning fact about Alfred Rosenberg. He knew, he saw, he was told directly, by his own subordinates, what was happening in the occupied territories. The mass shootings, the starvation, the systematic murder of Jewish communities by the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units that followed the German army like a shadow. And he kept his title. He kept his office. He kept his salary, because in the end, the ideology mattered more to him than the humans it was destroying. But there's another layer too. Rosenberg's wartime crimes that most people don't know about. While the killing was happening in the fields and the forests, Rosenberg was also running one of the largest organized looting operations in human history. It was called the Einsatzstab Rosenberg. Rosenberg, the RR, and its mission was to steal, systematically, bureaucratically, ruthlessly, Jewish libraries, synagogue artifacts, priceless artworks, private family collections built over generations. Rosenberg's teams swept through occupied Europe like academic locusts, cataloging, crating, and shipping back to Germany hundreds of thousands of cultural objects. The goal wasn't just theft. The goal was erasure. If you destroy a people's art, their books, their cultural memory, you don't just kill the generation. You kill the story. You make it easier, generations later, for someone to say they were never really here. Rosenberg understood this with the cold precision of an ideologue. He wasn't looting out of greed. He was looting out of vision. And that, somehow, makes it worse. By 1944, everything was collapsing. The Eastern Front had reversed. The Allies had landed in Normandy. The dream of a 1,000-year Reich was quietly revealing itself to be a 10-year catastrophe. And Alfred Rosenberg, the man who had spent 20 years building the intellectual foundation of National Socialism, was watching it crumble in real time. His ministry was becoming irrelevant. His access to Hitler was fading. The inner circle that had once treated him as a founding father was now too busy surviving to return his calls. There's something almost painfully human about this moment. A man who gave everything to a movement only to be sidelined by that same movement when it stopped needing thinkers and started desperately needing soldiers. He wasn't arrested. Not yet. He was just ignored. And for a man whose entire identity was built on being the intellectual soul of Nazism, that invisibility must have been its own kind of torment. But the real reckoning was coming, and it would happen not in Berlin, not in a bunker. It would happen in a courtroom in Nuremberg. Where for the first time in history, the architects of genocide would have to sit down, face their accusers, and answer for what they built. And Alfred Rosenberg, the man who once wrote the blueprint, would have nowhere left to hide. November 1945, Nuremberg, Germany. The same country that had cheered at rallies, that had raised arms in salutes, that had looked away while the trains kept running. Now it was hosting something the world had never seen before, a trial, not a summary execution, not a secret military tribunal, a real, documented, internationally witnessed trial where 21 of the most powerful men in the Third Reich sat in a wooden dock and were forced to listen to the evidence against them. It was called the International Military Tribunal, and it would last nearly a year. Alfred Rosenberg sat in that dock and did something that surprised almost everyone who watched him. He stayed calm, not the calm of a man at peace, the calm of a man who had spent his entire life constructing an intellectual fortress and still believed, somewhere deep inside, that the right argument could save him. He was wrong, but he didn't know that yet. Here's what makes Rosenberg's behavior at Nuremberg so fascinating and so disturbing. Unlike Hermann Goering, who performed for the courtroom with theatrical arrogance, Rosenberg was quiet, measured, almost academic. He answered questions carefully. He parsed words. He drew distinctions between what he wrote and what others did. His defense, essentially, was this: I built the ideas. I didn't pull the triggers. And in any other context, that argument might have opened a genuine philosophical debate. But this wasn't a philosophy seminar. The prosecutors had documents, thousands of them, many of them signed by Rosenberg himself, orders, directives, memos approving the theft of Jewish property, administrative correspondence that placed him squarely inside the machinery of the Holocaust, not as a distant theorist, but as a functioning, decision-making official. Every time Rosenberg tried to separate himself from the consequences of his ideology, the prosecution simply held up another piece of paper with his signature on it. There was no argument left. Only paper trails and bodies. October 1st, 1946, the judges read their verdicts, one by one. The defendants heard their fates. When they reached Alfred Rosenberg, the courtroom went quiet. Guilty on all 4 counts. Conspiracy to wage aggressive war. Waging aggressive war. War crimes. Crimes against humanity. The sentence, death by hanging. Rosenberg reportedly showed almost no reaction. No tears. No outburst. No less dramatic speech. Just a slight tightening of the jaw. A barely perceptible stillness. The man who had spent 30 years writing about racial destiny now faced his own, and it was 15 days away. October 15th, 1946, the final night. The condemned men were held in Nuremberg prison, small cells, dim lights, a military chaplain making quiet rounds. Most of the men spent that last night in some form of reckoning. Some prayed, some wept, some spoke to the chaplain for hours. Rosenberg refused the chaplain entirely. He had built a worldview that replaced Christianity with a Nordic racial mythology, and even now, with the rope literally hours away, he would not abandon it. There's something almost tragic about that stubbornness. Not sympathetic, never sympathetic. But deeply, uncomfortably human, because it shows you how completely a person can be consumed by an ideology, how a set of ideas, chosen, cultivated, nurtured over decades, can become so fused with identity that even death cannot separate them. He ate his last meal. He lay in his bunk, and somewhere in those final dark hours, Alfred Rosenberg, the man who wrote the intellectual foundation of the most murderous regime in modern history, waited alone. 1:11 a.m., the gymnasium of Nuremberg prison had been converted into an execution chamber. 3 wooden scaffolds stood inside. Black curtains. 2 American Army chaplains present. A small group of witnesses, journalists, military officials, allied representatives. The executions began just after midnight. One by one, when Rosenberg's turn came, he walked in without a blindfold request, without a final statement prepared, without the dramatic last words that some of the others offered. When asked if he had any final words, he said one thing. Just one. No, that single word, delivered flatly, without ceremony, somehow said everything. The hood was placed over his head, the noose adjusted, and then, what happened next became one of the most disturbing details of that entire night. The drop was botched, unlike some of the other executions that proceeded with grim efficiency. Rosenberg's hanging was not clean. Witnesses reported that it took far longer than it should have, that the process was prolonged, that what should have been instantaneous was not. The U.S. Army Master Sergeant who oversaw the executions that night, John C. Woods, was later criticized for his technique. Several of the Nuremberg hangings that night were described by witnesses as slow and agonizing. Whether that was incompetence or something else, history has never fully settled. What is settled is this: at 1:30 a.m. on October 16, 1946, Alfred Rosenberg was pronounced dead. Here's what I want you to take away from this story. Alfred Rosenberg was not a monster in the way that word usually gets used. Some inhuman creature born broken, impossible to understand. He was a man, educated, articulate, capable of writing sentences that other educated people found persuasive, and that is precisely what makes him so important to understand, because the Holocaust didn't begin with gas chambers. It began with words, with books, with pamphlets, with lectures at universities, with ideas that were dressed up in the language of science and philosophy and cultural identity, until they felt legitimate to enough people that no one stopped them in time. Rosenberg built the permission structure. He gave the hatred a vocabulary, an intellectual framework, a sense of historical destiny, and then he watched from his comfortable ministerial office while other men used that framework to murder 6 million Jewish people and millions more across occupied Europe. The Nuremberg Trials didn't just punish individuals. They established something radical and new: the idea that there is such a thing as a crime against humanity, that certain actions are wrong not just by the laws of a single nation, but by the shared moral standard of the entire human race, and that the men who build the ideology, not just the men who pull the triggers, are accountable too. Alfred Rosenberg spent his life writing that certain people didn't deserve to exist. The final verdict of history is this: it was his ideology that didn't deserve to exist, and the courtroom at Nuremberg made sure the world knew it. If this story made you think, share it, because this is exactly the kind of history that needs to be understood, not forgotten. History exists to make sure these stories stay alive, not to glorify them, but to make certain we never stop learning from them. Subscribe if you haven't already. The next video is already waiting for you. And until then, keep questioning, keep learning. History isn't just the past. It's a warning.